Okay, so welcome everybody. Today, Stephen and I are going to be talking about special education law, inclusion, accommodations, and modifications, and what these look like inside the classroom. So today, two of the terms that I'm going to be talking about are accommodations and modifications. So in general, accommodations, normally it means to help or assist somebody. And I'm gonna discuss what that means and how that looks like inside the classroom. And for modifications, generally speaking, means a change in something that we're doing. So moving forward, what are accommodations and modifications? So right now, just take some time to think because I know what accommodations and modifications are and what that looks like in the classroom, but just take a few seconds to think of what you think it looks like in the classroom, in the Sped classroom, and then I'll go over the definitions and what they actually look like. Okay, so accommodations. So in general, I said accommodations are there to help or assist individuals on general terms, but how does this apply to special education? So in special education, accommodations allow students to complete the same assignment or test as other students, but with the change in timing, formatting, setting, scheduling, response, and or presentation. So once again, accommodations in SPED, they allow students to complete the same assignment as other students, but with the change in timing, formatting, setting, scheduling, response, or presentation. So I provided some examples of what that looks like inside the classroom. So an accommodation in the classroom would be providing books and other written materials in alternative formats such as Braille, large print, audio formats, and digital text. So for example, if I had an individual that was blind and I gave them a print book, that would have no use to them. So an accommodation would be to provide a book in an audio format so they could access it. Another example of an accommodation would be to sit the students close to the teacher or a positive role model. And this is simply allowing them to remain focused and be closer proximity control. Another example would be to provide visual aids. And along the same lines would be to highlight keywords and directions. And these are removing the barriers of presentation. So these are not changing anything. They're just good techniques to give students to help them access the information. Another example would be to provide additional time to complete a task. And this would be removing a barrier of timing. The last example I have for accommodations is to allow students to use assistive technology. So this could mean many things, but an example would be to allow a student to use speech to text to give a response to an answer. So we talked about what accommodations are. So modifications and what is that in a special education setting. So modifications, the definition is an adjustment to an assignment or a test that changes the standard or curriculum of what the assignment or curriculum is supposed to be. So once again, a modification is an adjustment to an assignment or a test that changes what the standard or the curriculum is supposed to be. So I have a couple of examples of what that might look like in the classroom. So a modification would be providing alternative books with similar concepts but easier reading levels. So if I'm in an 8th grade and if I have my students reading at an 8th grade level about Thomas Edison, and I allow another student who has a lower reading level and I give him a 2nd grade reading level, I am changing what the curriculum is. Another example would be assigning fewer homework questions. So if I had my whole class doing odd for math, odd every odd question, but I have Timmy over here and I'm only assigning six questions, that is dramatically changing what the assignment is. Another example would be weigh daily work higher than tests for students who perform poorly on tests due to a disability. So instead of grading everybody with the test being a little higher, I'm just weighing their work on their daily, what they do daily. So that's adjusting, that's changing what I'm asking for, the curriculum. And the last example would be to allow for shorter reports. And once again, you could see that this is an example of changing what the curriculum is, what the standard is. So if I'm asking my high school seniors to do a 5-page paper on global warming, but I have Samantha over here and I'm only asking for 2 paragraphs, that's dramatically changing what the curriculum is. So we talked about what it is, and you might be asking, what's the difference between accommodations and modification? You might be even asking yourself, are there differences between the two? And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to identify there are. So we talked about what they are, but let me talk a little bit about what they're not meant to do. So specifically for accommodations, they do not change the expectations for learning. So they also do not reduce the requirements of the task, and they do not change what the student is required to learn. So those are the 3 things that we need to keep in mind, what they're not doing. So they're not changing the expectations. So they're still learning, they're still getting the same content. They're not reducing the requirement. They might be changing as in maybe they need a little extra time, but the assignment is still there. And it's not changing what the students are required to learn. They're still getting the content and the subject matter. So next is modifications. So modifications, just a refresher. So they do change the expectations for learning. And also they do reduce the requirements of the task. As mentioned, we might be talking about the same thing. We might be talking about Thomas Edison, and I might be asking you to do an assignment on Thomas Edison, but the requirement of the task is being changed dramatically. So now I have a couple of examples. So I want you guys, when you guys are thinking about this, I want you guys to think about the stuff we've talked about. What is an accommodation? What's a modification? What is it supposed to do? What aren't they supposed to do? And then I'm gonna give you guys a couple seconds to answer these questions. If you're with someone, you could discuss it. If not, maybe you could write it down, and then I'll go over what it is. So the first one, Mr. Casanova has to allow what this is and ask yourself, is this changing the timing, formatting, setting, scheduling, or presentation of the assignment, or is this changing the whole standard and the curriculum? So take a few seconds and we'll go over it in a moment. Okay, so specifically for this one, by myself allowing Victoria to leave the classroom 3 minutes earlier to avoid crowded hallways, I'm not changing the curriculum or the standard. I am simply allowing Victoria to leave 3 minutes earlier because maybe she's in a wheelchair, maybe she needs to just that extra time to get from where she needs to get. So this is an accommodation. So if you guess that, then good job. The next one, Mrs. Arana has to provide partial grade based on individual progress or effort. So we're looking at provide partial grade based on progress and effort. So let's ask ourselves, is this changing? Is this a change in timing, formatting, or setting, or maybe even response time? Or let's ask ourselves, is this a change in the standard or the curriculum? So go ahead and take a couple seconds, about 20 seconds, discuss it, write it down, and then we'll go over what the answer is. Okay, so for this one, this is actually a modification. We have to look at the key things are providing partial grade based on effort. So this is changing the standard and the curriculum. And we need to make sure that we understand that, because had this been a different case or a different scenario where we're allowing a change in just the way that they're responding, it would have been an accommodation. But since this is your grading based on progress and effort, that is a modification. So the next one is Mrs. Anderson allows Neo to do an open book test. So once again, I want you guys to think about, am I changing the formatting? Am I changing the response, how I could respond to this, or maybe the presentation? Or is this a dramatic change as in the standard or the curriculum? So go ahead, take a couple seconds and discuss or write this down, and then we'll go over. So when it comes to this one, we got to look at the key thing. So allowing Neo to do an open book test. So when you're allowing a student to do an open book test, you're opening the door so they could use all the information, all these other information that they don't have present. So they're using the book to help guide them. So this is a modification. Had it been maybe a change in, you could take an extra hour, it would have been an accommodation. But by allowing Neo to do an open book test, it is changing the standard, because you're grading them based off of the book as well, because you're allowing them access to that book. And the last one would be Mr. Casanova pairs Naomi with students who model good behavior for classwork, projects, and mentoring. So take a couple seconds and just think about everything we've discussed, and we'll find out what this is. But think about those things. This accommodation or modification. Is this changing the curriculum, or is this changing the setting or formatting? So about 10 more seconds. Go ahead and write it down. Okay, so for this one, this is an accommodation, because you're pairing Naomi with another student because you want them to model that good behavior. You're not changing the standard or the curriculum. You're just changing maybe the seating and the setting because you want them to model that good behavior. So if you got them all right, good job. If not, it's okay. So right now, currently, everything is distance learning. As we all know, everything is online. So this is kind of our theme for the conference, and I just wanted to touch on this. So I brought this up because even though we're teaching from home and students, everybody's at home, I wanted to highlight that even with all this going on, that there's laws that require us, and Steven's going to talk about that we need, if a student per IEP needs longer time or some type of modification or accommodation, that by law we still have to follow this. So I just wanted to highlight that. And also, I know someone else in the group is talking about UDL, but this fits so well with accommodations and modifications that I felt like I needed to include it. And UDL is a universal design for learning. And this is an educational framework based on research and learning sciences that guides the development of flexible learning environments and learning spaces that can accommodate individual learning differences. So we know that we're all different learners. We all learn different ways. So this is simply saying that, we have different ways to engage students, and we could provide different representations and different ways for students to express what they want to say. So if we incorporate this with our students, then it's just a good method to go that way. And I just wanted to close with this illustration of equality and equity. So equality on one side shows that as a teacher, if I'm gonna teach one way, I'm gonna assign my students to read this book and to do a 10-page paper, and all of you guys are getting it equally. So that's one side. However, on the other side is equity. So if Timmy right here on the left side could learn the way that I'm telling him, so here's a book, write a 10-page paper, and if he gets it, then good job. But Samantha in the middle, she might not be able to get that just with the way I'm giving her instructions. So she might need a little bit more time, maybe an extra day to get the assignment done. But Derek on the other end, on the right side, might need the extra time and maybe a change in the reading material. So all this is saying is that it's better to give the students what they need, what they need to succeed, instead of just everybody getting equally the same. So that's my portion, and Stephen will talk about SPED law.
Hello, my name is Stephen, and I'm going to talk about special ed law. So before we get into this, I have this graphic here, this triangle graphic. And what this essentially is, it's the federal legislative framework for special education. So if you look at the different types of tiers, we're going to start from the bottom and work our way up, and how these legislative laws have built on each other throughout the time and have gave rights and a voice to people with disabilities, people and students with disabilities. So to start off, we're going to talk about the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Next slide, please. So starting from the bottom. So we have, so within the Rehabilitation Act, we have a section known as Section 504. And what this essentially did, it gave disability rights to people, and gave them opportunities to be successful out in not only in school, but in work environments as well. So what this did, it prohibited discrimination based upon the disability, and it gave civil rights statute that required the needs of students with disabilities to be met as adequately as the needs of the non-disabled are met. So Renee did a good job about explaining about accommodations, and this is where accommodations come from. It gives students access to either curriculum, daily activities, classrooms, so they could be successful in like their non-disabled peers. Go ahead, next slide. So quick pop quiz. Now, is this an accommodation? So I have an example here. Getting extra time on a test. Is this an accommodation? Yes or no? I'm going to give you a couple seconds to think about it, and then I'll go ahead and explain why it is not an accommodation. Okay, so the answer is yes. If you chose yes, good job. So the reason why this is an accommodation, again, like Renee explained the difference between modification and an accommodation. Modification is completely changing what's expected of them, and accommodation is just simply giving them access. Now, getting extra time on test or an assignment isn't changing the test or assignment, but to help the student gain more access to be more successful at the assignment or test, getting extra time on it would increase their chances of being more successful. So in this case, getting extra time on a test or an assignment would be considered an accommodation. Thus coming from the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504. Next slide, please. So again, we're gonna come back to this framework for special ed and how it kind of builds on each other. Now, the first one we went over, the Rehabilitation Act, specifically the Section 504 that states that that disabled peers cannot be discriminated against and must have the same access like everybody else. It gives them, it's laid the foundation and the framework of their rights. Okay, so the next thing we're going to cover is the Americans with Disability Act, or otherwise known as ADA for short. So ADA, so what is this, how does this build upon the Rehabilitation Act? So This became law in 1990, whereas in the Rehabilitation Act, like we just talked about, started in 1973. So now we're getting somewhere with this. So in 1990, the ADA is a civil rights law that prohibits the discrimination against individuals with disabilities. Okay, in all areas of public life. So now we're kind of broadening where people with disabilities are gaining access and have rights to. So public life, and this is including jobs, schools, and also transportation. So public transportation, trains, buses, etc. And anything that is public or private places that's open to the general public. So this purpose of the law is to make sure that the people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities like everybody else. Okay, so let's go ahead to the next slide. Now, ADA in action. I guarantee everybody has seen ADA in action, whether they've walked to the store or they've drove somewhere, they parked the car in a parking lot. You have seen this act in action wherever you go. So in our first starting from our left, we have what looks like a ramp. Now, the reason why we have stairs and also we have ramps. Ramps for people with canes, ramps for people in wheelchairs, or have orthopedic or physical disabilities that would make going upstairs a little bit more difficult. So this would be a result of ADA, this act in action. Also, we have what's called these tactile crosswalks. This is for visually impaired people who may not see where the street or the sidewalk ends or starts. So you have these so people could fill out where the road ends and where it begins. And that's obviously to keep them safe and keep them from not getting hit by a car. And then everybody is familiar with this sign right here. This blue sign it looks like a person in a wheelchair. Now we all know where we can find this in almost every parking lot you have been to has this. Grocery stores, I mean, you name it, it's law that we have handicap parking for people that don't have to walk so far to get where they need to be. So this is all an example of ADA in action. So again, coming back to this framework and how all these different acts and laws have building on each other, we started with the Rehabilitation Act that started in 1973, and that gave just basic rights to people with disabilities. It gave them access, just basic access to things that they did not have access before. And then we kind of broadened that to ADA by now giving people access to public and private places that are open to the general public, including schools, jobs even, which was huge, and also transportation. So now we're going to get into Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that was passed in 1997 and also was revised in, I think, 2004. Renee is going to go ahead and play the video I have. It's about a 3-minute video explaining how this act works.
Have you ever had the experience of being the only person in a classroom who had trouble doing something or understanding a certain concept? How would you feel if every day in school you faced the same kind of difficulty while everyone else seemed to find the work easier than you? What kind of support and teaching would you need to keep trying? The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is a law that was passed to help and support students who face this situation every day. The current version of the law was passed in 2004, but it's based on a law that was first created in 1975, known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. It revolutionized the education of children with disabilities, which, in 2001, was more than 6 million children. The IDEA requires that public schools provide specialized services to all children with disabilities from birth to age 21 for the purpose of granting equal access to education. A specific part of the law mandates public schools to create an individualized education program, or IEP, for each student who is found to have an eligible disability. An IEP is a document that is drawn up and agreed upon by teachers, parents, specialists, and, if possible, the student. The document describes the present achievement level of the student, then specifies goals for the school year, as well as any special support needed to achieve those goals. In other lessons, we'll discuss learning disabilities in more depth and how to use an IEP in the classroom. The focus of this lesson is the law itself. Let's visit Cornerstone Elementary to see an example of the IDEA in action. Meet Susie. Susie is a bright, energetic third grader who loves school. Susie has a hearing impairment. She's not deaf, but her hearing is poor enough that it affects her educational performance, as she has trouble hearing any of her teachers. Susie would qualify for special assistance under the IDEA. Her IEP would include information about her hearing impairment, such as the most recent hearing test results, and would also outline multiple goals and services agreed upon by her parents and teachers. Although Susie might meet with a specialist once or twice a week, most of her time would still be spent in the classroom with all of her fellow students. This is because another aspect of the IDEA is the requirement that a student with a disability be educated in the least restrictive environment possible, or LRE. In other words, a student like Susie who has a disability should have the opportunity to be educated with her non-disabled peers to the greatest extent possible. Susie should have the opportunity to interact with her peers and have the same access to educational experiences as everyone else. Susie may just need additional resources, such as visual aids, to optimize her learning. Individualized education programs and least restrictive environment are the two most well-known principles of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. However, there are four
Okay, so that concludes the special ed law. Now we're just going to review on what we've talked about. Next slide. Now, what act put this in place? Was it the Rehabilitation Act, ADA, or was it IDEA Act? I'll go ahead and give you like a couple seconds to just to think about it, discuss, and we'll go ahead and discuss why this is, what act put this in place. So the act that put this in place was the Americans with Disabilities Act. And if you remember, we talked about how this broadened the rights of people with disabilities. So in public life, transportation, and in public schools. So this would be an example of ADA. Now, what act first ensured people with disabilities couldn't get discriminated against? I'll go ahead and give you a couple more seconds to maybe discuss this, think about it, and we'll talk about it together. So the act that first kind of defined the word disability and also gave rights to people with disabilities was the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504 in 1973. So this ensured that people with disabilities could not be discriminated against. And finally, last review question, what act helped better define the rights of students with disabilities? The act that helped better define the rights of students with disabilities was IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so this better defined the word disability and gave students way more access, and also helped them get more services through the documents that their individualized education plan, and so on. Now, so the second part of what I'm presenting is inclusion. So in inclusion, so this is has been a highly popularized concept in today's schools. And what this means is, what this essentially is doing is having kids from students with disabilities, non-disabled peers, and also language restricted students, and giving them the same access by having them in the same room with getting the same contents from the same teacher. So having them in the same room, having the same access like everybody else. Now, where did this idea of inclusion come from? So if you remember from our video that talked about the Individual Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, this word came up, least restricted environments, or known as LRE. So what least restricted environment is having an environment where the students can still have support, at the same time still be challenged and have access to the same curriculum like their other peers in a general education setting are getting. Now, what supports can look like could be very different. Now, so what does that mean? Do we just throw them in gen ed, general education, and just cross our fingers and hope they'll be fine? No, I kind of touched on this a little bit, but we have to give our language restricted students and our students with disabilities a chance. We can't just throw them in and just, well, we're fulfilling LRE, or least restricted environment, so, we're good. We have to give them supports. We have to get them either modifications or accommodations. And so I'm going to be going over on what those might look like in an inclusion class. Now, so some supports and what they might look like in an inclusion class is, for one, assistive tech. Now, this could be a technology to help somebody communicate. This could be technology to enlarge print. Anything. So any sort of technology that would help them be successful in their classroom. Another one would be a one-on-one aid. Now, this could be a one-on-one instructional aid that could help them with their organization, help them with their instruction, their content that they're receiving from their teacher. Or this could be a behavioral aid. Now, behavioral aid will, just like in the name, it will be focusing on more behavioral management skills, things that will help that student, again, be more successful in the inclusion setting. And their last supports would be a co-teach. Now, this is also a more popularized idea, where we have a general education teacher and a special education teacher working together in a collaborative setting in the same classroom, where you have the general education teacher being the master of the contents and the special education teacher being the master of access. So two heads collaborating, trying to make sure that they are, in a way, if you could picture in your mind, casting a huge net to make sure everybody in their classroom is getting the same opportunity and having the same amount of access like everybody else, is essentially the goal in the co-teach setting. Now, so I wanted to end this presentation by letting you all create what an inclusion class might look like in your mind. So I have like some instructions I want you to do. So either on a piece of paper, or you could just discuss it with the person you're watching with. how would you, or what would you think a successful inclusion class would look like? What are some things and procedures you would put in place, or what are some supports that you would put in place to help your kids have access? I want you to put your teacher hats on and think like a teacher for a little bit. Also have in mind that within the classroom, you have all these students with different minds going at different paces. So how could you provide the best amount of supports and with allowing your students to have the most amount of access they can to be successful. So that concludes Renee's and I's presentation. I hope you've learned something and hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.